Welcome back to Media7, where I'm discussing the revised Search and Surveillance Bill and what it means for an independent press with David Parker MP, Tim Murphy and Phil Kitchen. Phil, I want to go back to you because you made a very interesting point about whistleblowers. You have yourself reported on the police. The police are an agency which will have these powers. Does that concern you particularly?
It does, because there could be scenarios. For instance, let's play out a speculative one. So there was a senior police officer, or more than one senior police officer, who was a plant by an organised crime group, and another police officer passed me information confidentially and said, I think that this guy's a plant and is feeding information to organised crime. I started doing we start doing some investigation. We don't have enough to get the story out there because we don't feel legally sound in that. Potentially, and I know it sounds sort of fantasy land, but it's not. Potentially, this could lead to police officers, if they were senior enough, because they, as I understand the legislation, they need to be an inspector to apply for one of these orders. It could lead to them being able to whitewash inquiries into themselves.
Tim Murphy, do you share that fear? Because you report on the police as well.
Yeah, I do. I think that the agency gaining the power can sometimes be the source, theoretically. We had a situation where in the last while, we had information to us that on a major crime that I think was in advance of what the police had. And I think they got to the point where they thought that someone within the police was giving us information from the inquiry, and there was talk then of making a move to open us up. I think if you have the examination order system, that would make it very difficult to resist that, particularly if it's a serious crime that a judge in that instance, would have to look at and say, well, it's a violent crime, it's a crime that the public is outraged by. Your right to silence, at least your right to protect sources, is secondary.
So the potential is that they can get to you while you're still investigating the story?
Yes, and while they still are. And before perhaps they've even got a suspect who they have in mind, but also because they might want to tidy up their own backyard rather than the actual investigation of the crime.
David Parker, who has these powers?
The only two that are in the fray are the serious fraud office and the police. And I mean, I absolutely agree that we have to be very careful around this. I mean, I think that I was a bit surprised at the pressure that was put upon John Campbell in the VC Medal case under the Evidence Act, where he was called as a witness and asked to disclose information that he was uncomfortable disclosing. Now, there's already a test under the Evidence Act which tries to appropriately balance interests in media freedom and other public interests, but I was a little surprised to see the pressure in respect of what, you know, I don't want to minimise the importance of those medals, but no one's life was at risk, and it wasn't a series of sort of organised crime activity, and yet there was significant pressure that had to be resisted by TV3 and John Campbell before they eventually did get to, I think, a reasonable place that didn't require him to disclose his source. But it's sort of an instance, I think, of where something was of widespread public appeal and therefore popular, and then therefore put pressure on the agencies of the state to reach a solution and not look silly compared with how much TV3 knew. But when you analyse it, really was it that important an issue that justified pressure that put at risk media freedoms?
Now, you also mentioned the powers of the Serious Fraud Office. You did make an attempt to have those reined in as part of the Select Committee process, didn't you? What happened to that?
Well, the government so far has said, well, look, they didn't want to do it through this bill. We have got correspondence open with the Minister, and I think the Minister is open to looking at the issue, and I think he might have said something similar to representatives of the Media Freedom Committee. I think that would be one of the most important things that come out of this.
You also said in your minority view you would like to see an exception for media in these cases.
Well, I must admit I'm not completely clear on that in my own mind, and I want to consider the arguments on both sides of that, because you know, the absolute privilege that attaches to some relationships has never been had never been quite the same for the media, and there will be logic behind that distinction, and so I'm not completely convinced that it's right to have a complete exclusion. I'm open to the idea, but I'm yet to be completely convinced.
Well, you put it in the Select Committee reports.
No. Not quite in those terms. I mean, we said that unless there were further protections that were built in, we couldn't support it. But I think with further protections, both in respect of the Serious Fraud Office and appropriate thresholds in respect of organised crime, which are a bit low in respect of production orders at the moment.
Tim Murphy, what's your idea of a fix? Do you think there should be a blanket exemption for media?
We do on examination and production orders. We started off in our submissions on this bill focusing on the search warrants. And we thought there should be not exemptions for media, that ultimately the police ought to be able to seek a search warrant against newsrooms, but only after the privilege for the media and the police's reasonable case were weighed by a judicial officer, a judge. What happens now is they don't have to consider in advance the privilege. That's where we started with that. But with these, we believe if they're going to, especially on examination orders, set aside right of silence, it will be very damaging to have that hanging over newsrooms, not for the media companies or the journalists as a body for their sake, but for what that means and what it represents. That the public, and Phil mentioned this, that if the public and the whistleblowers and those involved in organisations where these crimes are taking effect, if they don't have confidence that their confidentiality can be kept, then the truth won't out. The public right to know will diminish. So we think, certainly for examination orders and probably for production orders, and we also believe that the search warrants are there. You know, why extend it to media? There may be some particular cases in those very complex, serious crimes for examination orders, but we do think that needs a lot more thought.
Phil Kitchen, I imagine that the public, some members of the public are going to be thinking, why should the news media have special rights in law? There are responsibilities attached to those rights. In your
view, absolutely. Of course, there are, and there have been occasions where, I mean, I'm still a citizen, and if I know that there's a crime that's been committed, that doesn't mean I'm necessarily going to immediately go and collaborate with the police if it's part of my investigation. But there have been occasions where I have collaborated with the police in my work. Because I know that I've got evidence that there was a crime, and people, you know, quite a number of people have gone to jail, whether as a result of my story or whether as a result of discussions with police. But this is not that point. This is not the same issue. To me, this is about diluting the powers, leaving it, although it still is under existing legislation, it is in the hands of a judge. But judges don't always, to my mind, make the right decisions. Sometimes with suppression orders, for instance, they don't necessarily act in the public interest.
I'm afraid we're going to have to conclude here. Thank you to David Parker, Tim Murphy and Phil Kitchen. Now, for digital media professionals working in far-flung New Zealand, it's hard to get networking time with the creative heavyweights of the entertainment industry. The annual AnimFX conference seeks to change that by inviting some top talent to give talks and workshops and maybe give someone a job.
A wee while ago, I was wandering around Tupapa with a wireless mic, desperately trying to find a story. And then I stumbled across a large group of people. So I walked over to a dude and said, "Sorry, mate, what's happening here?"
Well, this is AnimFX. It's a conference about games, animation, and visual effects.
Jackpot! Speaking at the conference was Dean Dublar, co-director of animated Carry On, How to Train Your Dragon.
I'm wondering what you think CG animation does differently or possibly better to traditional 2D animation.
You know, just in terms of detail, hair, fabric, skin, you know, fur, everything that you can kind of cover your character in is just sort of brought to life with a sense of realism that you don't get in hand-drawn animation. Whereas I would say hand-drawn animation does have some strengths as well. You can design as many worlds and environments as you want because it's just a drawing and a painting away, as opposed to having to build an environment. So there are restrictions on both sides.
Also attending was Stacey Longstreet, the former art director for Wizards of the Coast, the owners of Dungeons and Dragons.
Our fans, to some extent, will certainly let you know if you go off target. So it was a great responsibility to stay within what D&D started out as 35 plus years ago and what it's evolved to today. There are a lot of things that have evolved, and there are a lot of things that are classic and the same. You know, a beholder will always look like a beholder. It will always have 10 eye stalks.
A popular speaker was Brent Young, who makes theme park attractions for a living. His company Super 78 makes digital rides using something called 4D.
4D attraction is essentially a stereoscopic attraction, only now you're bringing elements, sensory elements into the theater. So you're bringing light effects, smoke effects, wind effects, sound, and then also scent, bringing scent into the theater. For instance, in the last movie I did a flying over a pine forest. And so I had to smell 50 different types of pine forest till I got the right evergreen that I wanted to smell. And we actually have scent cannons that we install in the ride. And this creates a real heightened sense of reality and gives the guest a better experience and really gives them a more visceral experience.
You've actually inspired me. I've got a couple of concept ideas. This is kiwi. He's a kiwi fruit.
Yeah, got it.
Unfortunately, he's borrowed a lot of money and he's tied it all up in low yield property. So his house is for sale there. He's had to sell it. He's got a spiralling alcohol addiction.
Right.
He's led him to start reading Investigate, to start looking for a left-wing scapegoat.
Right.
Maybe we could have flying Dow Jones numbers come through. Yeah, we could fly through Wall Street, maybe. Sort of come down on the floor, the trading floor.
I gotta say, I've not seen it.
Really?
Yeah.
I mean,
no, not this one. Let's see what else you got.
Ah, right.
Okay.
Well, Raz Vadika, spice detective. So he's a detective, but he investigates spice crimes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
maybe you need to work on these concepts a little bit.
Yeah, I think
get
so.
back to you.
I'm sure that the kiwi fruit was going to be, because it's all there. You got the cute fruit. It's also a parable about eating healthy. So that was just a small taste of AnimeFX 2010. I've had such a good time, I suspect I'll be here next year, and I recommend that you do the same.
Jose Barbosa there with the finger food. And that's our show. Thanks again to David Parker, Tim Murphy and Phil Kitchen, and to you for watching. Media7 will be back next week with a special from the SPADA conference. Until then, goodbye.